March 19, 1945. The forests of Bavaria. Major Matthias Vogel stood at the edge of a clearing, his breath forming clouds in the cold morning air as he stared at something that shouldn't exist here, deep in the heart of the Reich. The aircraft lay crumpled against a stand of pine trees, its silver skin catching the weak sunlight like a mirror. Even broken and smoking, the machine possessed a beauty that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't one of theirs. The sleek lines, the distinctive bubble canopy, the checkered nose markings, all of it screamed American engineering. A P-51 Mustang. The fighter that had been systematically destroying the Luftwaffe for the past year. Matthias had been hunting Allied bombers when his wingman spotted the smoke. They had expected to find one of their own Messerschmitts or perhaps a downed American bomber crew to capture. Instead, they found this. The pilot's body lay 50 meters from the wreckage, his parachute tangled in the branches above. An American boy, couldn't have been more than 22. His face peaceful in death, as if he had simply fallen asleep among the German pines. Matthias removed his leather gloves and knelt beside the young man, finding his identification tags. Second Lieutenant James Mitchell, from a place called Ohio. The same age Matthias had been when this war began, back when he still believed in victory, in honor, in the rightness of their cause. Behind him, Sergeant Gunther Wolf approached with cautious steps, his mechanic's eyes already assessing the damaged aircraft. "Chief," he said quietly, using the informal address they had adopted after 3 years of flying together. "This machine, it's mostly intact. The engine took damage, but the airframe, the systems, I think we could salvage it." Matthias stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement. He was only 32, but he felt ancient, worn down by years of watching friends spiral into the earth, of pretending that Germany's situation wasn't deteriorating with each passing month. He walked toward the Mustang, running his hand along its cold metal skin. Up close, he could see the quality of the construction, the attention to detail, the robust engineering that spoke of a nation with resources to spare. In his own squadron, they were flying aircraft held together with improvised parts and desperate hope. Fuel was rationed so severely that training flights had become a luxury they couldn't afford. Young pilots were sent into combat with barely 20 hours of flight time, lambs to the slaughter against experienced American and British aviators. And here, crumpled in a Bavarian forest, lay evidence of everything they had been trying not to see. The war was already lost, they just hadn't admitted it yet. They brought the Mustang back in pieces, working through the night to transport it to their base outside Munich. The squadron's hangar had once housed 12 aircraft. Now it sheltered 5 battered Bf-109s and this silver ghost from across the Atlantic. Matthias watched his men work with a focus he hadn't seen in months, their exhaustion forgotten as they carefully assembled the American fighter like archaeologists reconstructing a forbidden artifact. Gunther moved around the aircraft with reverence, his weathered hands tracing the panel lines and examining the construction techniques. "The fuel system alone is remarkable," he muttered, more to himself than to Matthias. "Self-sealing tanks, redundant pumps, quality we stopped achieving 2 years ago." He looked up, his eyes reflecting the dim hangar lights. "Chief, this isn't just a better aircraft. This is proof of an industrial capacity we cannot match." Matthias knew Gunther was right, but hearing it spoken aloud felt dangerous. Such talk could be considered defeatism, punishable by execution in these desperate final months. Yet here they were, examining the very evidence of their defeat, unable to look away. Lieutenant Joseph Engel joined them, notebook in hand. He had been documenting every detail of the Mustang's construction, sketching the engineering solutions that German designers had either missed or lacked the resources to implement. "The engine," he said quietly, "is a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin. 1,200 horsepower. Our latest Daimler-Benz engines are lucky to produce half that, and they break down constantly." Captain Werner Hoffmann emerged from the cockpit, his tall frame folding awkwardly through the canopy. "The instrumentation is straightforward," he reported. "No overcomplications, just effective design. And the visibility," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "A pilot in this aircraft can see everything. Our Messerschmitts have blind spots that get men killed." Matthias climbed onto the wing, peering into the cockpit himself. The Americans had painted kill marks on the fuselage. 16 small swastikas, each representing a German aircraft. Destroyed. 16 of his countrymen, shot down by the young pilot now lying in their makeshift morgue. He wondered how many of those 16 he might have known. The hangar door creaked, and everyone froze. But it was only Martin Lang, their radar operator, bringing hot ersatz coffee that tasted like burned acorns. He distributed the tin cups silently, and for a moment, they all stood around the Mustang like mourners at a funeral. "We're looking at the reason we're losing, aren't we?" Martin finally said. "Not tactics, not courage, just simple mathematics. They can build 10 of these for every one of our fighters." Matthias sipped his terrible coffee, feeling its warmth do nothing to dispel the cold truth settling into his bones. His father had flown in the Great War, had warned him about the American industrial machine. But Matthias had been young and certain, infected with the propaganda about German superiority and destined victory. Now, standing beside this captured Mustang, he finally understood what his father had tried to tell him. Matthias couldn't sleep. He lay in his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling of the officers' quarters, while memories he had buried for years clawed their way to the surface. He remembered 1940, when the Luftwaffe seemed invincible. He had been 27 then, a young pilot with 73 confirmed kills, his chest decorated with the Iron Cross, his future bright with promised glory. The newsreels had shown him shaking hands with Göring himself, the Reichsmarschall praising the brave young pilots who were bringing Britain to its knees. How proudly he had worn that uniform. How certain he had been of their technological superiority, their tactical brilliance, their righteous cause. The propaganda ministry had told them that American aircraft were inferior, that American pilots were soft and undisciplined, that the Reich's engineering prowess would inevitably triumph. Matthias had believed every word because believing was easier than questioning, because doubt was dangerous, because everyone around him believed too. He remembered the parties in Berlin, the celebrations after France fell, the absolute conviction that the war would be over by Christmas 1941. Then came Russia, the endless steppes that swallowed entire armies, the winter that froze fuel lines and killed men in their cockpits, the gradual realization that perhaps the Reich had overreached, that perhaps the promises of quick victory had been premature. But even then, they had been told to have faith. Secret weapons were coming. Jets that would sweep the skies clean of Allied aircraft, rockets that would devastate London. Victory was still certain, just delayed. Matthias had wanted to believe. He had needed to believe because the alternative was unthinkable. If Germany wasn't destined to win, then what had the last 5 years meant? What about the friends who had died, believing they were heroes? What about the cities he had helped protect by shooting down enemy bombers, knowing that German bombers were doing the same to English and Russian cities? The moral weight of it all required the justification of ultimate victory. But now, lying in the darkness with the image of that silver Mustang burned into his mind, he couldn't maintain the fiction anymore. He thought about his younger brother, Hans, killed over Stalingrad 3 years ago. Hans had died believing in the cause, believing they were defending the fatherland against subhuman hordes. Would he have wanted to know the truth? Or was ignorance a mercy? Matthias rose and walked to the small window. Dawn was breaking over the airfield, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. Somewhere to the west, thousands of aircraft like that Mustang were preparing for another day of missions. Somewhere to the east, Soviet armies were crushing German defenses with overwhelming numbers. And here, in this small corner of Bavaria, a handful of pilots were confronting a truth that the Reich's propaganda machine had worked desperately to conceal. They had been lied to. The war had been lost before it truly began. And pride, that most dangerous of virtues, had blinded them all. The work on the Mustang became an obsession. For 3 weeks, Matthias's men stripped the aircraft down to its bones and rebuilt it with meticulous care. They worked mostly at night, when prying eyes were less likely to notice, when the constant drone of Allied bombers overhead provided cover for the sounds of their labor. Gunther had become the project's heart and soul, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle as he coaxed broken components back to life. The engine required the most attention. The American pilot had pushed it hard during his final moments, and the strain showed in cracked housings and damaged cylinders. But even in its wounded state, the Merlin engine taught them lessons. Each component they examined revealed a philosophy of manufacturing they had forgotten. Tolerances were precise, but not overly complicated. Parts were designed for replacement rather than endless repair. Everything spoke of an industrial system that valued efficiency over perfection. Joseph documented it all, his notebook filling with sketches and observations that would be considered treasonous if discovered. "Look at this fuel pump," he whispered to Matthias one night, holding the component up to the light. "It's designed to be replaced in minutes. Our pumps require hours of labor to access, let alone repair. They're building for war. We're building for peacetime precision that we can no longer afford." Werner discovered something even more troubling in the cockpit. Behind a panel, he found a small manual labeled "Pilot's Notes." It was written in clear, straightforward English, explaining every system with practical simplicity. He brought it to Matthias, who had learned English from his mother, a woman from Hamburg who had worked as a translator before the war. As Matthias read, his hands began to shake. The manual assumed the pilot was intelligent, but needed clear instruction. There was no mysticism about flying, no suggestion that only special men could master these machines. It was democratic in a way that German military doctrine had never been. "They assume their pilots are competent professionals," Matthias said quietly, "not warriors blessed by destiny. They train them properly and give them tools that work. We send boys into combat with 20 hours of training and tell them their will to victory will compensate for their lack of skill." Martin brought disturbing news from the radio room. He had been monitoring Allied communications, a task that had become easier as German encryption systems failed. The Americans were producing over 2,000 fighters per month. 2,000. The entire Luftwaffe, at its peak, had possessed fewer than 5,000 aircraft total. "How do we fight mathematics?" Martin asked, his voice hollow. "How do we defeat an enemy that can replace every aircraft we destroy twice over before the wreckage stops burning?" The men gathered around the Mustang that night understood they were no longer simply repairing an aircraft. They were conducting an autopsy on their own delusions. Every bolt they turned, every system they examined, every elegant solution they discovered was another nail in the coffin of German victory. The Mustang wasn't just evidence of American superiority, it was a mirror showing them exactly how thoroughly they had been deceived. April 12, 1945. The morning arrived with unusual clarity, the sky a deep blue that pilots called severe clear. Perfect conditions for what Matthias was about to do. The Mustang sat on the tarmac, its repairs complete, its silver skin gleaming in the early light. Gunther had done the impossible, coaxing the wounded American fighter back to operational status with salvaged parts and sheer determination. Matthias walked around the aircraft slowly, performing the pre-flight inspection with hands that trembled slightly. He had flown dozens of different aircraft during his career, but this felt different. This felt like stepping across an invisible line from which there would be no return. Werner helped him into the cockpit, adjusting the unfamiliar American harness system. The parachute fit differently, the seat positioned him higher, everything was simultaneously alien and surprisingly comfortable. The instrument panel made immediate sense, despite being labeled in English. Airspeed, altitude, fuel, engine temperature, all arranged with logical clarity. He touched the throttle, feeling its smooth resistance, then placed his feet on the rudder pedals. The cockpit felt roomier than his Messerschmitt, the canopy providing visibility that seemed almost excessive. He could see everything. No blind spots, no awkward angles, just clear views in every direction. Gunther stood on the wing, talking him through the start sequence they had learned from the pilot's manual. Master switch, fuel pumps, mixture rich, throttle cracked open. Matthias pressed the starter button and the Merlin engine coughed, turned over, then roared to life with a sound like rolling thunder. The whole aircraft vibrated with barely contained power. He had never felt anything like it. His Bf-109 was a precision instrument, a scalpel. This was a hammer. He taxied to the runway, the tail coming up easily, the steering responsive despite the aircraft's size. Werner and Joseph watched from beside the hangar, their faces tight with apprehension. If anyone reported this unauthorized flight, they would all face firing squads. But Matthias had stopped caring about official permission. He needed to know. He needed to understand what his enemies possessed, what advantages they flew with every single day. The takeoff roll was shorter than expected. The Mustang leaped into the air like something eager to escape gravity, climbing at a rate that made him catch his breath. He banked left, feeling the controls respond with precision and power. No sluggishness, no hesitation, just immediate translation of intention into action. He pushed the throttle forward, and the acceleration pressed him back into his seat. He climbed to 3,000 meters in minutes, a climb rate his tired Messerschmitt couldn't match on its best day. Then he leveled off and simply flew. He rolled, dove, climbed, pushed the Mustang through maneuvers that would have stressed his own aircraft to its limits. The American fighter handled it all with ease, as if asking for more. Matthias felt tears on his cheeks and didn't know if they came from joy at flying such a magnificent machine or despair at understanding how completely outmatched his side had been. Matthias landed the Mustang with a mix of exhilaration and crushing despair. The moment the wheels touched German soil, he understood that everything had changed. He couldn't unknow what he had just experienced. He couldn't pretend anymore that skill and determination could overcome such vast material superiority. The other pilots crowded around as he climbed from the cockpit, their faces hungry for information, desperate to hear that perhaps the American reputation was exaggerated. He couldn't give them that comfort. "It's better than anything we have," he said simply. "Better visibility, better performance, better range, better everything. We've been fighting with one hand tied behind our backs, and we didn't even know it." The silence that followed was deafening. Lieutenant Hans Becker, a veteran with 41 kills, was the first to speak. "So we've been dying for nothing? All our friends, all those missions, for nothing?" Matthias wanted to say no, wanted to offer some consolation, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he gathered his core group in the briefing room that evening. Joseph, Werner, Gunther, Martin, and 3 others he trusted completely: Captain Friedrich Adler, Lieutenant Anton Meyer, and Sergeant Helmut Krantz. 8 men who had flown together, fought together, and survived when so many others hadn't. They deserved the truth. He told them everything. The engine specifications Joseph had documented. The fuel capacity that gave American pilots range German fighters could never match. The robust construction that could absorb battle damage and keep flying. The industrial numbers Martin had intercepted. He laid it all out like a prosecutor presenting evidence of a crime. When he finished, no one spoke for a long moment. Anton finally broke the silence. His voice was quiet, almost lost. "I have a son. He's 14. They're talking about conscripting boys for the Volkssturm, giving children rifles and telling them to stop Russian tanks. If this war continues, my son will die defending a cause that's already lost." Friedrich nodded slowly. "My sister lives in Dresden. Lived in Dresden. The city was destroyed 2 months ago. Tens of thousands dead in a single night. And still they tell us victory is near. Still they demand we sacrifice more." Werner stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening airfield. "We took an oath," he said. "We swore to defend Germany. But what are we defending now? A regime that's fed us lies? A leadership that's willing to see the entire nation destroyed rather than admit defeat?" Gunther spoke up, his mechanic's pragmatism cutting through the emotion. "Every day we keep fighting, more people die. More cities burn. More children lose their fathers. The question isn't whether we're losing. That's already settled. The question is how many more must die before it ends." Matthias looked at each man in turn, seeing his own doubts and fears reflected in their faces. They had crossed a threshold together. The captured Mustang had shown them the truth, and now they had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Surrender was treason. Continuing to fight was madness, but perhaps there was another option. The SS arrived 3 days later. 2 officers in black uniforms, their faces hard with suspicion, their authority absolute. Matthias watched from the window of his quarters as their staff car pulled up to the headquarters building. His stomach tightened. Someone had talked. Someone always talked. Within an hour, he was summoned to meet with Sturmbannführer Erich Keller, a thin man with cold eyes, who sat behind the commandant's desk as if he owned it. "Major Vogel," Keller began without preamble, "we've received reports of defeatist talk among your squadron. Discussions questioning the Reich's ultimate victory. Seditious suggestions that Germany cannot win this war." Matthias kept his face neutral. His hands relaxed at his sides despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "My men are tired, Herr Sturmbannführer. We've been flying combat missions for years with diminishing resources. Occasional grumbling is natural. It means nothing." Keller studied him for a long moment. "I'm told you've been conducting unauthorized activities. Strange sounds from your hangar at night. Unusual security around one particular aircraft." Matthias felt sweat forming at his collar, but maintained his composure. "We salvaged a downed American fighter for intelligence purposes. My mechanics have been examining its construction to identify weaknesses we might exploit." Surely the SS appreciates the value of understanding enemy capabilities. The deflection was smooth, and Matthias saw a flicker of uncertainty cross Keller's face. "Show me," the SS officer demanded. They walked to the hangar together, Keller's adjutant following 2 steps behind. Matthias's mind raced, calculating. The Mustang was there, fully repaired, clearly flight-ready. Any expert would see immediately that this was more than simple examination. But perhaps Keller wasn't an expert. Perhaps he could be convinced. Gunther met them at the hangar door, his face carefully neutral. He had hidden Joseph's notebooks, removed the English manuals, stripped away anything that might suggest their true purpose. The Mustang sat in the center of the space, looking like a museum piece rather than an operational aircraft. "Impressive machine," Keller admitted, walking around it slowly. "Have you learned anything useful?" Matthias launched into a carefully prepared explanation, mixing truth with misdirection. He talked about fuel system vulnerabilities that didn't exist, structural weaknesses they hadn't found, tactical limitations that were pure invention. Keller listened, nodding occasionally, and Matthias began to hope they might escape this encounter intact. Then Keller stopped beside the wing, running his hand along a seam. "This aircraft has been completely restored," he observed quietly. "That seems excessive for simple examination." "This could fly, couldn't it, Major?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Before Matthias could answer, Werner appeared at the hangar door. "Herr Sturmbannführer, urgent message from Berlin. You're required to return immediately. The invasion of Berlin has begun." Keller's face went white. He stared at Werner, then at Matthias, then back at the messenger. Without another word, he turned and left, his adjutant scrambling to follow. Matthias watched the staff car speed away, his heart pounding. They had bought time, but how much? And what would they do with it? That night, Matthias sat at his desk with paper and pen, writing letters he knew would never be mailed. The postal system had collapsed weeks ago, and even if it hadn't, what he needed to say couldn't survive military censorship. But he wrote anyway, because some truths demanded to be spoken, even if only to ghosts and silence. To his wife, Elise, in Berlin. "My dearest, I don't know if you're still alive. I don't know if our home still stands, or if the Russians have already swept through our street. I think about you every moment, about the life we planned when this war ended. We were going to have children, remember? A house in the countryside, away from the cities and the politics. I wanted to teach our son to fly, the way my father taught me. Now I wonder if there will be a Germany left for children to inherit." He paused, the pen trembling in his hand. What could he tell her about the Mustang, about the revelation that had shattered his certainty? How could he explain that her husband had spent the last month confronting the reality that everything they had sacrificed had been for nothing? "I've learned something terrible, Elise. We were lied to. The promises of victory, the assurances of our superiority, all of it was smoke and mirrors. The enemy we face is so far beyond us in capability that we never had a chance. Every day we continue fighting is just another day of pointless death. He sealed that letter and began another, this one to his mother in Munich. She was 71 now, living alone since his father's death in 1942. Dear Mother, do you remember when Papa tried to warn me about this war? He said the Americans had an industrial capacity that would eventually overwhelm us, that we were repeating the mistakes of the Great War. I was so young, so certain he was wrong. I wish I could tell him he was right. I wish I could apologize for my arrogance. The third letter was the hardest. He addressed it to his brother Hans, dead these 3 years, buried somewhere in the frozen wastes around Stalingrad. Little brother, you died believing you were a hero, believing Germany's cause was just and our victory inevitable. Should I be grateful you never lived to see the truth? You were 23, Hans. 23 and frozen in a trench, defending a city we should never have tried to take, in a war we could never win. I used to think your death had meaning. Now I don't know what to think. He wrote until his hand cramped, filling pages with confessions and regrets, with love and loss and the terrible weight of understanding. When he finally stopped, dawn was breaking. He gathered all the letters, walked outside, and burned them one by one, watching the smoke carry his words into the gray morning sky. Some truths were too dangerous to commit to paper, some grief too deep to share. The letters had served their purpose simply by being written. Now they could join all the other things this war had destroyed. Lieutenant Dieter Koch was 20 years old, and everything Matthias had once been. Blonde, eager, eyes bright with absolute conviction in the Reich's destiny. He had arrived at the squadron 2 weeks earlier, fresh from training school with barely 30 hours in a cockpit, his uniform crisp and unwrinkled, his faith in victory unshakable. He made Matthias feel ancient and tired in ways that had nothing to do with age. Dieter sought him out after morning briefing, his face flushed with excitement. Major Vogel, I wanted to ask about the American fighter in our hangar. Some of the men have been saying troubling things about it, suggesting it's superior to our aircraft. Surely that can't be true. German engineering is the finest in the world. The Führer himself has said so. Matthias looked at this boy, this child in a uniform, and felt a wave of something between pity and anger. What have they been saying exactly? He asked carefully. Dieter's expression hardened. Defeatist talk, sir. Suggestions that we can't win, that American production is too great, that our cause is lost. I've heard Sergeant Wolf and Captain Hoffman speaking this way. It's corrosive to morale. It's treasonous. The word hung between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Matthias chose his next words very carefully. Lieutenant, these men have been fighting since 1939. They've earned the right to express frustration without being accused of treason. Dieter's jaw tightened. With respect, Major, frustration and defeatism are different things. The Führer has promised new weapons that will turn the tide. Jets, rockets, wonder weapons that will sweep our enemies from the skies. We must have faith. Faith. Matthias repeated quietly. Tell me, Lieutenant, have you seen these wonder weapons? Have you flown one of these jets? Dieter's face reddened. Not personally, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. The Reich scientists are the most advanced in the world. We're on the verge of breakthrough. Victory is still within reach if we just maintain our will to fight. Matthias recognized the phrases from propaganda broadcasts, the empty promises repeated so often they had become liturgy. He thought about showing Dieter the Mustang, letting him see the evidence with his own eyes. But he saw something in the young lieutenant's face that stopped him. Dieter didn't want truth. He needed belief, the way a drowning man needs something to cling to. Showing him reality would only make him more dangerous. You're dismissed, Lieutenant, Matthias said quietly. Dieter saluted sharply and left, but Matthias could feel the young man's suspicion like a physical presence in the room. That evening, he gathered his trusted men and told them about the conversation. We have a problem, Werner said grimly. True believers are more dangerous than the SS. They'll report us out of genuine conviction, believing they're saving Germany. Anton nodded. The boy's a threat. We need to either convert him or contain him, and quickly. Matthias looked at their faces, seeing his own fear reflected there. The walls were closing in. Time was running out. April 14, 1945. The news arrived during morning roll call. Dresden had fallen. Berlin was encircled. American and Soviet forces were racing toward each other across a Germany that no longer existed as anything more than a geographic expression. But it was the other news, whispered from pilot to pilot, that broke something fundamental in the squadron's collective spirit. The camps had been discovered. Martin had been monitoring BBC broadcasts, a capital offense, but no one cared anymore about regulations. He gathered the men in the briefing room and told them what the British were reporting. Places called Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. Industrial facilities for murder. Millions dead. Jews, political prisoners, anyone the regime deemed undesirable. The details were so horrific that at first Matthias wanted to dismiss them as propaganda. Surely this was exaggeration. Surely no civilized nation could commit such atrocities. But Friedrich's face had gone gray. He sat down heavily, his hands shaking. "My cousin worked for the SS," he said quietly. "Administrative duty in Poland. He came home on leave 2 years ago, drunk himself unconscious every night, wouldn't speak about what he'd seen. I thought he was just traumatized by combat. Now I understand. We all looked away. We all chose not to see." Even Dieter's certainty seemed shaken. He stood in the corner, his young face struggling to process information that contradicted everything he had been taught. "This can't be true," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The Führer would never allow such things. We're soldiers, not murderers." Joseph looked at him with something like pity. "We were soldiers for a regime of murderers. That makes us complicit, whether we pulled triggers in those camps or not." The room fell silent. Outside, the sound of aircraft engines being tested echoed across the airfield. Routine sounds of a war that no longer had any purpose except to prolong suffering. Matthias felt something break inside him, some final barrier between duty and conscience that he hadn't even known existed. Anton spoke first. "My brother-in-law was Jewish. They took him in 1938. My sister never heard from him again. I told myself he was in a work camp somewhere, that he'd come home when this ended. I knew better. Deep down, I knew." Werner stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I can't do this anymore. I can't fly another mission defending this. I won't kill one more Allied pilot who's trying to stop what we now know was happening. If they shoot me for refusing, so be it. At least I'll die with something resembling honor." Gunther nodded slowly. "The Mustang isn't just proof we're losing a war, it's proof that we deserve to lose. Any nation capable of what we've done doesn't deserve victory." Matthias looked around the room at these men he'd fought beside for years. Their faces showed shock, grief, shame, and something else. Relief. Relief that the pretense was finally over, that they could stop defending the indefensible. Even Dieter had tears streaming down his face, his faith shattered beyond repair. The war was ending. The question was how they would face what came after. They met in the hangar at midnight. 11 men gathered around the silver Mustang, like conspirators planning revolution. Matthias had called them together with a simple message, passed quietly during evening mess. "We need to make a choice." Every man present understood what was at stake. Desertion meant death, if caught. Surrender might mean prisoner of war camps or worse. But continuing to fight for a regime they now knew was monstrous seemed impossible. Matthias spoke first, his voice steady, despite the fear churning in his gut. "We have an opportunity that few German soldiers possess. We have aircraft, we have skills, and we have proof of our sincerity." He gestured to the Mustang. "The Americans will be suspicious of any German unit trying to surrender. They'll assume it's a trick, a desperation ploy. But if we come bearing this, their own aircraft fully restored, it demonstrates that we understood what we were fighting for and chose to stop." Friedrich raised the obvious problem. "The entire squadron?" There are 42 pilots here, Matthias. Even if we all agree, coordinating a mass defection is nearly impossible. Someone will panic. Someone will inform. We'll all end up against a wall. Werner had been thinking about logistics. Not the entire squadron. Just those of us in this room, plus anyone else we absolutely trust. Maybe 20 aircraft total. We fly west in the morning, when everyone expects us to be on patrol. Low altitude to avoid radar. We use the Mustang as our lead aircraft, with white sheets tied to our tails as surrender flags. Anton looked skeptical. And if the Americans shoot us down before they realize we're surrendering? If they see German fighters approaching and respond as they're trained to do? It's a risk we all take, Matthias acknowledged. But consider the alternative. We stay here, flying missions until we're killed, or the war ends in unconditional surrender. Either way, we'll be judged for serving this regime. At least this way, we choose our ending. Joseph had been quiet, but now he spoke. Some won't come. Dieter, for one. Even after learning the truth, he's too rigid. He'll see this as betrayal rather than conscience. We'll have to leave him behind. The thought troubled Matthias. Dieter was young, misguided, but not evil. Leaving him to face the consequences of their desertion seemed cruel. But Joseph was right. The lieutenant would never agree to this plan, and they couldn't risk him reporting them before they could execute it. Helmut raised another concern. Families. Most of us have loved ones in Germany. When we defect, the SS will go after them. It's what they do to traitors' families. The room fell silent. This was the calculation that haunted every man present. Their own lives weighed against the lives of parents, siblings, wives, children. Martin finally spoke, his voice heavy. The war is ending. The SS will have bigger concerns than revenge against deserters' families. And if Germany falls as completely as it appears to be falling, maybe the chaos will protect them. Matthias looked at each man, seeing the same struggle reflected in every face. This wasn't just about survival. It was about choosing who they would be when this nightmare ended. April 17, 1945. Their last night as Luftwaffe officers. Matthias couldn't sleep, so he walked the perimeter of the airfield under a moonless sky, listening to the distant thunder of artillery that grew closer each day. Tomorrow morning, 18 pilots would climb into their aircraft and fly toward an uncertain future. 18 men who had decided that conscience mattered more than orders, that some lines couldn't be uncrossed simply by claiming obedience. He found Werner sitting on the wing of his Bf 109, smoking a cigarette in violation of every safety regulation. The captain offered the pack, and Matthias took one despite having quit 2 years earlier. They smoked in silence for a while. Two men who had known each other since flight school, who had celebrated victories and mourned losses together. I keep thinking about my first solo flight, Werner said quietly. I was 18, terrified, absolutely certain I would crash. My instructor told me that fear was healthy, that overconfidence killed more pilots than enemy fire. I wonder what he would think of us now. Matthias exhaled smoke into the darkness. He'd think we finally learned the difference between courage and stupidity. Werner nodded. In the morning, we become deserters. Traitors to some, cowards to others. But I'd rather be a living coward than a dead hero for a cause that was rotten from the beginning. In the barracks, some of the men were writing final letters, though Matthias had warned them such correspondence was too dangerous. Friedrich sat on his bunk, cleaning his service pistol with methodical precision. Anton played cards with Joseph and Martin, their laughter forced and brittle. Helmut was praying quietly in the corner, rosary beads moving through his fingers. Gunther found Matthias in the hangar, performing one last inspection of the Mustang. The mechanic had spent hours ensuring the American fighter was in perfect condition, understanding that their lives might depend on its performance. "Chief," he said, using the old familiar address, "whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know, working on this machine, learning the truth, it gave me back something I thought I'd lost. My integrity." Matthias gripped his shoulder, unable to find adequate words. At 0300 hours, they gathered one final time. Matthias went over the plan again. They would take off at dawn, claiming to be flying a standard patrol. Once airborne, they would form up and turn west, flying low through valleys to avoid detection. The Mustang would lead, its American silhouette hopefully buying them precious seconds before Allied fighters engaged. White sheets would trail from every aircraft. Their radios would broadcast surrender on all frequencies. "If anyone wants to back out, now is the time," Matthias said. "No judgment, no consequences from us. This is a choice each man must make for himself." No one moved. 18 faces looked back at him, showing fear but also determination. They had crossed their moral Rubicon. There was no going back. Friedrich stood and raised his tin cup of ersatz coffee in a mock toast. "To morning," he said quietly, "to whatever comes after." They all drank, tasting the bitter brew, knowing it might be their last taste of anything German. Dawn broke cold and clear on April 18, 1945. Matthias walked across the tarmac toward the waiting Mustang, his leather flight jacket zipped tight against the morning chill. Around him, 17 other pilots moved toward their Messerschmitts with the casual efficiency of men who had performed this ritual 1,000 times. To any observer, this was just another patrol, just another day in a war that refused to end. No one could see the hammering hearts, the sweating palms, the absolute terror hidden beneath professional composure. Matthias climbed into the Mustang's cockpit, feeling the unfamiliar American seat embrace him, one last time. Gunther gave him a thumbs up from the ground, then stepped back as the Merlin engine roared to life. One by one, the Messerschmitts started, their Daimler-Benz engines creating a symphony of barely controlled power. Matthias taxied to the runway, the other aircraft falling into formation behind him. In the control tower, the duty officer gave routine clearance, having no idea he was authorizing a mass defection. The takeoff was perfect. Matthias felt the Mustang lift cleanly, the other fighters rising behind him like a flock of steel birds. They climbed to 1,000 meters, heading east as expected, maintaining radio silence as briefed for patrol operations. Then, 5 kilometers from base, Matthias banked hard left, turning west toward Allied lines. The other aircraft followed without hesitation. Behind them, he imagined the confusion in the control tower, the frantic calls demanding they return to base, the realization slowly dawning that something unprecedented was happening. They dropped to treetop level, racing over the Bavarian countryside at 300 kilometers per hour. Matthias could see farmers in fields looking up in surprise, see the morning light glinting off rivers and lakes. Germany looked beautiful from up here, peaceful, as if the war were happening somewhere else entirely. He thought about his wife in Berlin, his mother in Munich, all the people below who had no idea their country was in its final death throes. Werner's voice crackled over the radio, breaking silence. White sheets deployed. "We look like the world's most dangerous laundry service." Nervous laughter rippled through the formation. The sheets, torn from barracks beds, streamed behind each Messerschmitt like surrender flags. Matthias reached for his own radio, switching to the international emergency frequency. "American forces, this is Major Matthias Vogel of the Luftwaffe. We are 18 German pilots seeking to surrender. We are flying west of Munich, bearing 270 degrees. We are trailing white sheets and have no hostile intentions. Please do not fire. We wish to surrender." He repeated the message in English, his voice steady despite the fear constricting his chest. For long minutes, only static answered. They flew on, every pilot scanning the sky for Allied fighters that could appear at any moment. Then, impossibly, 4 P-51s materialized off their wings, American markings bright in the morning sun. The lead Mustang's pilot came alongside Matthias, close enough to see his face. The American's expression showed pure astonishment. He gestured forward, indicating they should follow. Matthias nodded and turned to match the American's heading. They were no longer Luftwaffe. They were prisoners flying toward an uncertain future. The American base at Augsburg had been captured only 3 weeks earlier, and German equipment still littered the grounds. Matthias landed the Mustang first, following hand signals from ground, Crew whose faces registered shock at seeing one of their own fighters bearing Luftwaffe markings. The 17 Messerschmitts touched down in sequence, their white sheets dragging across the tarmac like ghostly remnants of another world. As Matthias climbed from the cockpit, he was immediately surrounded by American soldiers with rifles pointed at his chest. He raised his hand slowly, carefully. "I am Major Matthias Vogel. We wish to surrender. We have information about German positions and capabilities." The ranking officer, a captain named Robert Morrison, approached with obvious suspicion. "You flew a stolen P-51 into our base leading 17 enemy fighters. Give me one good reason we shouldn't assume this is some kind of attack." Matthias gestured to the Mustang. "We restored your aircraft and returned it. We're pilots, not fanatics. The war is over. We know it. We want to stop killing and being killed." They were separated immediately, each pilot taken to individual rooms for interrogation. Matthias spent 6 hours answering questions, explaining their discovery of the Mustang, describing how it had opened their eyes to the futility of continued resistance. His interrogator, a Major Sullivan from intelligence, listened with an expression that shifted from skepticism to cautious belief. The thing that convinced them wasn't Matthias's words. It was the notebooks Joseph had brought, filled with detailed technical analysis of the Mustang. It was the precision of Gunther's repairs to the aircraft. It was the consistent testimony from all 18 pilots about why they had chosen surrender over continued service. On the third day, they were gathered together in a briefing room. Major Sullivan stood before them, his face grave. "Gentlemen, we've verified your technical information and confirmed you're not part of some elaborate deception. But before we process you as standard prisoners of war, there's something you need to see." What followed was the most difficult hour of Matthias's life. Sullivan showed them films taken by Allied soldiers liberating concentration camps, footage of skeletal survivors, of mass graves, of gas chambers and crematoriums, evidence of industrialized murder on a scale that defied comprehension. Several of the German pilots vomited. Friedrich wept openly. Even Werner, always stoic, sat with his face buried in his hands. "This is what you served," Sullivan said quietly, his voice devoid of triumph or condemnation. "This is what you wore that uniform to defend. I believe you when you say you didn't know, that you were deceived. But ignorance doesn't erase complicity. You need to understand what you were part of." Matthias couldn't look away from the screen. He forced himself to watch every horrific image, to witness every moment of suffering. This was the price of his service, the cost of believing propaganda, the result of choosing not to question. When the film ended, Sullivan turned on the lights. "Tomorrow, you'll begin formal processing as prisoners of war. But tonight, I want you to think about what you saw. Think about what happens when good men serve evil causes." The prisoner of war camp outside Nuremberg was nothing like what Matthias had expected. No beatings, no starvation, no revenge for the years of warfare. Instead, they found clean barracks, adequate food, and American guards who treated them with professional detachment rather than hatred. It was almost harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Kindness required them to confront their humanity, to acknowledge that their enemies had possessed moral clarity they had lacked. The 18 pilots were kept together, housed in a section reserved for what the Americans called cooperative prisoners. Men who had surrendered voluntarily, who provided intelligence, who seemed genuinely disillusioned with the Nazi regime. Each day brought interrogations, not harsh or threatening, but thorough. American intelligence officers wanted to understand how the Luftwaffe had functioned, where bases were located, what capabilities remained. Matthias answered honestly, knowing that withholding information now served no purpose except prolonging suffering. But the real reckoning came in the form of education. The Americans called it reorientation, a program designed to help German prisoners understand what their nation had done. They were shown more films, given newspapers, exposed to testimonies from camp survivors. Each session felt like having skin peeled away, revealing wounds that could never fully heal. Joseph stopped eating for 3 days after hearing a survivor describe Auschwitz. Anton developed a tremor in his hands that never completely disappeared. Werner aged visibly, his hair going gray within weeks. Dieter appeared in the camp 6 weeks after their surrender. He had been captured during the final collapse of German resistance, his aircraft shot down while trying to defend Munich from American bombers. When he saw Matthias, his face contorted with rage. "Traitor," he spat. "You abandoned us. You abandoned Germany." Matthias looked at this young man who had once embodied everything he himself had been and felt only profound sadness. "We tried to save lives, Dieter. Yours included. If you'd come with us, you'd have survived without having to kill anyone else in a lost cause." Dieter's anger gradually gave way to confusion as he underwent the same reorientation process. Matthias watched the young lieutenant's certainty crumble, watched him confront truths that shattered his worldview. It was like watching someone die and be reborn, painful and necessary in equal measure. Friedrich received news that his sister had survived the war. She had hidden in the countryside, and American forces had liberated her village without resistance. He wept with relief, then guilt, knowing that his family's survival was random chance while millions of others had perished. In July, they learned that Nuremberg would host trials for Nazi leadership, war crimes tribunals where those responsible for atrocities would face justice. Some of the pilots wondered if they too would be charged if surrendering had merely delayed rather than prevented punishment. But Major Sullivan visited and explained that foot soldiers, even pilots, were generally not being prosecuted unless they had committed specific war crimes. "Your crime was believing lies," he said. "That's a human failing, not a legal one. What matters now is what you do with the truth." 25 years later, October 1970. Matthias Vogel stood in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., his American wife Helen beside him, their teenage daughter Anna exploring nearby exhibits. Before him, suspended from the ceiling in eternal flight, hung a P-51 Mustang. Not the one he had captured and restored, but seeing it brought everything flooding back. The fear, the revelation, the choice that had defined the rest of his life. After the war, Matthias had been one of the fortunate ones. His technical knowledge and willingness to cooperate had earned him early release in 1947. He had immigrated to America under a program for skilled engineers, finding work with Boeing in Seattle. He had learned to live with the weight of his past, carrying it not as a burden to escape but as a responsibility to remember. Helen had been a secretary at Boeing, a widow whose husband had died flying bombers over Germany. Their courtship had been complicated, built on honesty about who they had been and who they hoped to become. Werner had become a commercial pilot, flying passengers across routes he had once flown as an enemy. Friedrich taught engineering at UCLA, using German precision in service of peaceful innovation. Joseph had returned to Germany in 1955, working with the new democratic government to ensure the horrors of the past were documented and never forgotten. Of the original 18 who had surrendered that April morning, 16 had survived the post-war years. Anton had taken his own life in 1949, unable to reconcile what he had been part of. Helmut had died of natural causes in 1962, his heart simply giving out as if it had carried too much for too long. Dieter, the young believer who had called them traitors, had become a schoolteacher in Hamburg. He wrote to Matthias every year on April 18th, the anniversary of their surrender. "Thank you for saving my life," his letters always began. "Thank you for showing me that redemption was possible." The Mustang that Matthias had captured and restored had become something of a legend. After the war, it had been returned to American service, then eventually donated to the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson. Matthias had visited it 3 years earlier, standing beside the aircraft that had changed his life, running his hand along the fuselage where Gunther had so carefully repaired battle damage. A tour guide was explaining the aircraft to a group of school children. "The P-51 Mustang was one of the war's most important fighters," she said. "Its range and performance helped win the air war over Europe, protecting bombers and achieving air superiority that made D-Day possible." Matthias listened, remembering that morning when he had first seen sunlight glinting off silver skin in a Bavarian forest. The children asked questions about speed and weapons, innocent curiosity about machines they saw as historical artifacts rather than instruments of death. Anna found him, slipping her hand into his. "Dad, you're crying. Are you okay?" Matthias wiped his eyes, looking at his daughter, who had never known war, who had grown up in peace that his generation had paid for with blood and shame. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just remembering." She looked at the Mustang, then back at him with knowing eyes. She had heard the stories, knew what her father had been and what he had become. The aircraft that had shown him the truth, that had given him the courage to choose conscience over duty, hung above them like a silver ghost. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, some men could recognize truth when confronted with it. That redemption, though never complete, remained possible for those willing to face what they had done and choose differently. The war had been lost, but in losing, some had found their way back to being human.